the Battle of Kadesh. In 1274 BCE, beneath the burning skies of northern Syria, one of the largest armies ever assembled in the ancient world marched toward a city that should never have become legendary. Pharaoh Ramses II led nearly 20,000 Egyptian soldiers and more than 2,000 war chariots toward Kadesh, convinced that the Hittite Empire was retreating in fear. Scouts captured along the road claimed the enemy king had fled far to the north. The information appeared reliable. It was exactly what Ramses wanted to hear. But the desert silence ahead concealed something far more dangerous. As the Egyptian division stretched across miles of open terrain near the Orontes River, discipline began to collapse. Units became separated. Supply wagons lagged behind. Ramses advanced too quickly, believing victory was already within reach. Then the trap closed. Hidden behind the hills near Kadesh, thousands of Hittite chariots suddenly erupted from concealment and slammed directly into the exposed Egyptian camp. Ancient records describe the impact like a storm of bronze and splintered wood. Horses screamed as massive three-man chariots tore through tents, crushed soldiers beneath spinning wheels, and scattered entire formations before they could form defensive lines. Men were trampled into the mud beside the riverbank, while others drowned trying to escape across the water. The Egyptian army, considered one of the most disciplined military forces of its era, descended into panic within minutes. What made Kadesh especially terrifying was the scale and speed of the destruction. Ancient warfare often involved slow engagements and prolonged standoffs. Kadesh was different. It was violent movement, shock impact, mobile annihilation. The Hittites had weaponized momentum itself. Their heavier chariots functioned almost like ancient armored vehicles, smashing openings through enemy lines before infantry could react. Contemporary carvings later commissioned by Ramses depict bodies tangled beneath horses and shattered chariot axles scattered across the battlefield. According to Egyptian inscriptions, Ramses personally rallied his collapsing forces and charged directly into the Hittite assault. The official story claims he fought nearly alone against overwhelming numbers, driving the enemy back through sheer courage. Massive temple reliefs portray the pharaoh standing invincible atop his chariot, while enemies fall around him like rain. But historians have long questioned the account. Hittite records suggest Egypt came dangerously close to complete destruction. Some researchers believe Ramses survived only because reinforcements arrived unexpectedly from Allied forces entering the battlefield at the last possible moment. The aftermath became even stranger. Despite the catastrophic losses and inconclusive outcome, Ramses declared total victory. Monumental inscriptions celebrating the great triumph of Kadesh appeared across Egypt. The battle was immortalized in stone as proof of divine kingship. Yet years later, Egypt and the Hittites signed one of the first known peace treaties in recorded history. Neither empire had truly won. Both had nearly destroyed themselves. What survived was not the truth of the battlefield, but the version carved into history by those powerful enough to preserve it. Some scholars believe Kadesh represents the earliest large-scale example of military propaganda deliberately rewriting public perception after near disaster. The line between historical record and political theater may have been shattered here for the first time. Today, fragments of the treaty still survive in museums thousands of years later, but the real story of Kadesh remains buried beneath conflicting accounts, ruined cities, and the silence of the Syrian plains. If the official narrative of one of history's most famous battles could be manipulated so completely, then how many other ancient victories were constructed not from truth, but from survival and control? The Battle of Thermopylae. In 480 BCE, along a narrow coastal pass in central Greece no wider than a modern highway, a small alliance of Greek defenders prepared to face the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. King Xerxes of Persia had crossed into Greece with an army so vast that ancient writers claimed it drained rivers dry as it marched. Tens of thousands of soldiers advanced beneath banners stretching beyond the horizon. Against them stood a force that should never have survived more than a few hours. At the center of the defensive line were 300 Spartan warriors led by King Leonidas. Unlike most armies of the time, the Spartans did not fight for territory or wealth. They had been trained from childhood for one purpose alone: war. Witnesses described them calmly combing their hair and polishing their shields before the battle began, fully aware they were marching towards certain death. What happened at Thermopylae would transform a military defeat into one of the most enduring legends in human history. The pass itself became a weapon. Towering cliffs rose on one side while the sea pressed against the other, forcing the Persian army into a confined killing corridor where overwhelming numbers meant almost nothing. As the first Persian waves charged forward, Greek shields locked together into a solid bronze wall, spears thrust outward in perfect rhythm. The front lines of Xerxes' army crashed into the formation and collapsed almost instantly. Ancient accounts describe bodies piling so densely near the entrance of the pass that Persian soldiers were forced to climb over their own dead just to continue fighting. Arrows darkened the sky. Broken shields floated in blood mixed with seawater. Yet, the Greek line held. Again and again, Persian infantry attacked, only to be driven back into chaos. Even the immortals, Xerxes' elite royal guard, failed to break through. What made Thermopylae especially horrifying was not simply the violence, but the psychological effect. The Persian Empire had conquered nation after nation through sheer scale and intimidation. Entire cities surrendered before battle even began. But here, in a corridor of stone and dust, a few thousand defenders humiliated the greatest military machine on earth in full view of both armies. The myth of Persian invincibility began to crack. Then came the betrayal. A local Greek named Ephialtes revealed a hidden mountain path, allowing Persian forces to move behind the defenders. Leonidas quickly understood what was about to happen. Most of the Greek allies were ordered to retreat. The Spartans remained behind alongside a small number of Thespians and Thebans. They did not stay because they believed victory was possible. They stayed because their deaths had become part of the strategy. As Persian forces closed from both directions, the battle descended into slaughter. Spears snapped from repeated impacts. Swords dulled and shattered. Ancient historians claimed the Spartans eventually fought with knives, fists, and bare hands among heaps of corpses. Leonidas himself was killed during the fighting, and multiple Persian assaults reportedly centered around capturing or mutilating his body. The final Greek defenders were pushed onto a small hill where they continued resisting until buried beneath arrows and collapsing shields. But the strangest part of Thermopylae came afterward. Militarily, the battle was a Persian victory. Greece had failed to stop the invasion. Yet history remembers Thermopylae as though the Spartans won. Across centuries, the defeat became larger than the campaign itself. Statues were raised, poems were written. Entire civilizations adopted the battle as a symbol of resistance against impossible odds. Some historians believe Leonidas understood this from the beginning. Thermopylae may never have been intended to stop Xerxes permanently. It may have been designed to create something far more powerful, a story capable of outliving the battlefield itself. Today, the pass is wider than it once was due to centuries of shifting coastline and sediment. The exact killing ground has nearly disappeared beneath modern roads and fields, but the legend remains untouched. The question is no longer how the Spartans died. The real mystery is why humanity continues to glorify a hopeless massacre more than countless forgotten victories. The Battle of Gaugamela. In 331 BCE, on a vast plain near the ruins of ancient Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, two armies prepared for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the known world. One belonged to Darius III, ruler of the Persian Empire, the largest and wealthiest superpower on earth. The other followed a 25-year-old Macedonian king named Alexander, whose army had marched thousands of miles through hostile territory toward an enemy that outnumbered him several times over. What unfolded on that battlefield would not simply end a war. It would erase an empire that had dominated civilization for more than 2 centuries. Darius had chosen the battlefield carefully. The terrain was flattened and cleared for miles to maximize the effectiveness of Persian chariots and cavalry. Ancient accounts describe an army stretching across the horizon, with infantry, mounted archers, armored cavalry, and scythe chariots equipped with spinning blades designed to tear through enemy formations. Some estimates place the Persian force at over 100,000 men. Against them stood fewer than 50,000 Macedonians. At dawn, Alexander surveyed the Persian line and immediately recognized the danger. Unlike previous battles fought in confined terrain, Gaugamela offered nowhere to hide. There were no mountains, rivers, or narrow passes to reduce the Persian numerical advantage. If the Macedonian line collapsed even once, the entire army would likely be surrounded and destroyed. The battle began with movement rather than impact. Instead of charging directly forward, Alexander slowly shifted his army diagonally across the plain. The maneuver confused Persian commanders and forced Darius to extend his lines in response. Dust clouds rose beneath thousands of marching feet, while cavalry units repositioned under constant pressure. Ancient historians later suggested Alexander was searching for a weak point in the Persian formation, while simultaneously pulling enemy cavalry away from the center. Then the Persian assault began. Scythe chariots accelerated across the battlefield, with blades spinning from their wheels like rotating knives. Horses screamed as they charged toward the Macedonian phalanx. But Alexander's troops reacted with terrifying discipline. Infantry lines opened at the last second, allowing many chariots to pass harmlessly through controlled gaps before drivers were dragged down and killed behind the formation. Others were struck by volleys of javelins before reaching their targets. Within minutes, the attack that was meant to shatter the Macedonian line collapsed into confusion. What happened next became one of the most studied military maneuvers in history. Alexander identified a growing opening near the Persian center, where troop movements had created a vulnerable gap close to Darius himself. Leading his elite companion cavalry personally, he launched a direct assault toward the heart of the Persian line. Witnesses described armored horsemen driving forward in a wedge formation through clouds of dust, broken spears, and collapsing infantry. The attack moved with such speed that Persian commanders struggled to react before the Macedonians were already inside the formation. Then Darius fled. The exact reason remains disputed even today. Some ancient sources claim panic spread after Alexander's cavalry came dangerously close to the Persian king. Others suggest sections of the Persian army had already begun collapsing under pressure. Whatever the cause, once Darius turned his chariot away from the battlefield, the psychological foundation of the empire shattered instantly. Entire formations began retreating, while Macedonian cavalry cut through fleeing soldiers across the open plain. The slaughter continued long after organized resistance ended. Bodies covered the battlefield for miles. Persian camps were abandoned. Supply routes collapsed. Within months, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis would fall into Alexander's hands. One of the greatest empires in human history had effectively died in a single afternoon. Yet, historians still debate the deeper mystery surrounding Gaugamela. How did a vastly smaller army dismantle a global superpower so completely? Was Alexander truly a military genius beyond comparison? Or had the Persian Empire already begun collapsing from corruption, fear, and internal instability long before the battle began? What survived after Gaugamela was not merely victory, but a terrifying lesson repeated throughout history. Even the largest empire on Earth can appear unstoppable right until the moment it suddenly breaks apart forever. The Battle of Carrhae. In 53 BCE, beneath the merciless heat of the Mesopotamian desert, one of the most powerful armies in the ancient world marched toward a disaster so complete that Rome would spend generations trying to erase the humiliation from memory. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in the Roman Republic and one of the rulers of Rome itself, had invaded Parthian territory seeking glory equal to Julius Caesar and Pompey. Instead, he led nearly 40,000 Roman soldiers into a battlefield where traditional warfare suddenly stopped working. The Roman legions advancing eastward expected a conventional enemy. They had conquered Gaul, crushed rebellions, and defeated massive infantry armies across the Mediterranean. Roman warfare relied on discipline, close formation and combat, and relentless forward pressure. But near the ancient city of Carrhae, modern-day Harran in Turkey, they encountered something entirely different. The Parthians did not form dense infantry lines. They barely fought face-to-face at all. As the Roman columns crossed the open desert, dust clouds appeared along the horizon. Then came the horse archers. Thousands of mounted Parthian warriors circled the Roman army at high speed, while unleashing endless volleys of arrows from composite bows powerful enough to penetrate armor at long distance. The attack never stopped. Whenever Roman infantry attempted to advance, the Parthians retreated effortlessly while continuing to fire backward from horseback with terrifying accuracy. Ancient accounts describe the sound before the slaughter truly began. Parthian war drums echoed across the desert like thunder, while arrows struck Roman shields so continuously that soldiers compared the noise to heavy rain on rooftops. The Roman formation gradually compressed inward as casualties mounted. Men fell without ever seeing the enemy clearly. Armor became useless under constant bombardment. Horses collapsed screaming into the sand, with arrows buried deep into their necks and eyes. What made Carrhae horrifying was the realization spreading through the Roman ranks that there was no way to fight back. Roman infantry excelled in close combat, but the Parthians refused to remain stationary long enough for engagement. Every attempted charge ended the same way. The horse archers scattered, regrouped, and resumed firing from a distance. Worse still, the Parthians had prepared supply camels carrying enormous reserves of arrows, allowing them to continue attacking hour after hour without slowing down. Then the cataphracts arrived. These heavily armored cavalry units charged directly into weakened Roman formations, carrying long lances capable of piercing multiple men in a single strike. Entire sections of the Roman line collapsed under the combined assault of arrows and cavalry impact. Witnesses described soldiers dying where they stood, unable to advance or retreat while surrounded by dust, heat, and constant missile fire. Crassus' son, Publius, attempted to break the encirclement with a cavalry counterattack. The maneuver turned catastrophic almost immediately. His forces were isolated, surrounded, and systematically destroyed. According to Roman historians, surviving soldiers later watched in horror as Parthian riders displayed Publius's severed head on a spear before the Roman lines. By nightfall, the Roman army had effectively ceased functioning as an organized force. Thousands lay dead across the desert, while survivors attempted chaotic retreats under darkness. Crassus himself tried negotiating with the Parthians the following day, but the meeting dissolved into violence and confusion. Ancient sources claim he was killed during the encounter, though the exact details remain disputed. Later legends stated molten gold was poured into his mouth as punishment for greed, symbolizing Rome's obsession with conquest and wealth. The aftermath shattered Roman confidence in ways few battles ever had. Entire legionary standards were captured. Eastern expansion halted. Roman commanders suddenly realized that disciplined infantry alone could no longer guarantee victory against adaptive enemies using speed, mobility, and ranged warfare. Some historians believe Carrhae marked the moment ancient warfare began changing permanently. Rome had encountered an enemy fighting with tactics that resembled a far more modern style of combat: mobile warfare, psychological exhaustion, and destruction from distance rather than direct collision. For centuries afterward, Roman soldiers marching east reportedly spoke of Carrhae with fear. The desert where the legions vanished became more than a battlefield. It became a warning that even the most feared military machine in the world could be rendered helpless under the right conditions. The Battle of Arausio. In 105 BCE, near the banks of the Rhone River in southern Gaul, the Roman Republic suffered a military catastrophe so devastating that ancient historians struggled to describe the scale of the slaughter without sounding unbelievable. Entire armies disappeared in a single day. Tens of thousands of soldiers were cut down, drowned, crushed beneath fleeing crowds, or butchered while trying to escape through burning camps. The defeat at Arausio became one of the bloodiest disasters Rome had ever experienced. But what truly terrified survivors was the realization that the destruction had not been caused by superior strategy alone. Rome had helped engineer its own collapse. The threat had been building for years. Massive migrating tribes known as the Cimbri and Teutones had moved south across Europe, defeating several Roman forces before approaching the borders of Roman territory itself. Reports from scouts described enormous columns of warriors accompanied by wagons, livestock, and entire families traveling together like a moving civilization rather than a conventional army. Roman commanders initially dismissed them as primitive barbarians incapable of challenging disciplined legions. That arrogance proved fatal. Near Arausio, Rome assembled one of the largest military forces in Republican history. But instead of unity, the battlefield became poisoned by rivalry before the fighting even began. Two Roman commanders, Consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus and Proconsul Quintus Servilius Caepio, despised each other politically, and refused to cooperate. Their camps were positioned separately along the river, and both men competed for personal glory rather than coordinated defense. Ancient sources suggest the atmosphere inside the Roman camps had already begun deteriorating days before the battle. Officers argued openly over command authority. Scouts delivered conflicting reports. Reinforcements moved without coordination. Meanwhile, across the plains, the tribal coalition gathered in numbers large enough to unsettle even experienced veterans. Witnesses described endless fires burning across the hills at night, while war horns echoed through the darkness. The collapse began suddenly. Caepio, unwilling to share victory with his rival, launched an unauthorized attack against the tribal forces without waiting for support from the main Roman army. The assault failed almost immediately. The Cimbri and Teutones counterattacked with overwhelming force, crushing Caepio's troops and driving survivors directly toward the larger Roman camp positioned near the river. Panic spread faster than orders could be delivered. Before Mallius could reorganize his lines, thousands of fleeing soldiers crashed into Roman formations already preparing for battle. Then the tribal armies struck the main camp itself. Ancient historians described complete chaos as Roman defenses disintegrated under simultaneous assaults from multiple directions. Wagons overturned, horses stampeded through retreating infantry. Soldiers attempting to cross the Rhone drowned beneath the weight of armor and shields, while others were trampled along the riverbank trying to escape. What made Arausio especially horrifying was the sheer scale of the killing. Some ancient estimates claimed over 80,000 Roman soldiers and allied troops died, alongside tens of thousands of camp followers. While historians debate the exact numbers, nearly every surviving account agrees that the battlefield became one of the worst massacres in Roman history. Corpses reportedly covered the ground so densely that parts of the river changed course around piles of bodies and shattered equipment. Even more disturbing was the psychological impact inside Rome afterward. For decades, Roman citizens had believed their military system guaranteed dominance over so-called barbarian tribes. Arausio shattered that illusion completely. Fear spread throughout the Republic as rumors circulated that the Cimbri and Teutones were now marching directly toward Italy itself. Some senators reportedly believed Rome faced possible extinction. But the deeper horror of Arausio was not simply military defeat. It was internal decay. Rome had not fallen because its enemies possessed superior discipline or technology. It nearly collapsed because ambition, ego, and political division had infected its leadership at the exact moment unity mattered most. The disaster forced Rome into radical military reforms under Gaius Marius, permanently transforming the structure of the Roman army. Yet, even as Rome recovered, the memory of Arausio lingered like a scar. The battlefield became proof that the Republic's greatest weakness was not always beyond its borders. Sometimes the empire destroyed itself long before the enemy delivered the final blow, the Battle of Cannae. In 216 BCE, beneath the scorching summer heat of southern Italy, the Roman Republic marched toward what many historians still consider the most perfectly executed battlefield annihilation in military history. Near the dusty plains surrounding the small village of Cannae, Rome assembled an army so massive that its commanders believed sheer force alone would finally destroy the invading Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. Instead, by the end of the day, the battlefield had become a suffocating graveyard where tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died, trapped inside their own formation. The disaster began with confidence. Rome had suffered repeated defeats against Hannibal since his invasion of Italy, but Cannae was supposed to end the nightmare. The Republic mobilized nearly 80,000 infantry and thousands of cavalry, one of the largest armies Rome had ever deployed. Senators expected total victory. Many believed Hannibal's smaller multinational force would collapse under direct pressure from overwhelming Roman numbers. Hannibal wanted them to believe exactly that. At dawn, hot desert winds swept dust across the battlefield. As the Roman legions advanced toward the Carthaginian center, Hannibal positioned his weakest infantry deliberately at the front, in a curved formation protruding outward toward the enemy. Behind them stood hardened African veterans hidden deeper within the line, while cavalry forces guarded both flanks. As the Roman army surged forward, the center of Hannibal's line slowly began retreating exactly as planned. To Roman commanders, it looked like victory unfolding in real time. Thousands of legionaries pushed deeper into the enemy formation, convinced the Carthaginians were collapsing. But the more aggressively the Romans advanced, the tighter their own army compressed inward. Dense ranks of soldiers became packed shoulder to shoulder, with almost no room to maneuver weapons or shields effectively. Then the trap closed. Hannibal's African infantry pivoted inward from both sides like enormous iron doors slamming shut. At the same time, Carthaginian cavalry routed the Roman horsemen and attacked from behind. Within minutes, the Roman army found itself surrounded on every side. What followed barely resembled a battle anymore. Ancient accounts describe a human crush so dense that many Roman soldiers could not even raise their arms to fight. Men suffocated standing upright, trapped between bodies pressing from every direction. Others were slowly stabbed where they stood, unable to escape or even fall to the ground. Dust filled the air so heavily that visibility disappeared beneath screams, blood, and the metallic impact of shields collapsing inward. The killing lasted for hours. Unlike most battles where defeated armies eventually scattered, the Romans at Cannae had nowhere to run. The encirclement became tighter and tighter as Hannibal's forces systematically compressed the trapped legions into an increasingly smaller space. Some survivors later claimed the dead remained standing because the crowd was packed too tightly for corpses to fall. By sunset, the Roman army had effectively ceased to exist. Ancient historians estimated that between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day, including senators, officers, and much of Rome's military leadership. Entire noble bloodlines vanished on the battlefield. The scale of destruction shocked the Mediterranean world. Several Italian cities immediately abandoned Rome and joined Hannibal, believing the Republic was finished. Yet the deeper mystery surrounding Cannae lies in Hannibal himself. After achieving one of the most complete victories in military history, he did not march directly on Rome. Historians have debated this decision for centuries. Some believe his army lacked siege equipment and reinforcements. Others argue Hannibal understood something more disturbing. Rome could survive almost any battlefield defeat because its true strength was psychological endurance rather than military invincibility. Even after Cannae, Rome refused to surrender. But the memory of the battle never disappeared. For more than 2,000 years, military academies across the world have studied Hannibal's tactics at Cannae as the ultimate example of battlefield encirclement and total destruction. The plains where the Roman legions vanished became more than a historical site. They became a warning. Because Cannae proved that under the right conditions, even the most powerful army on Earth can be transformed into a prison of its own making. The Battle of Alesia. In 52 BCE, on a cold hilltop fortress deep within Gaul, tens of thousands of people found themselves trapped inside what would become one of the most ruthless military sieges in ancient history. The Gallic war leader, Vercingetorix, had united scattered tribes against Rome and retreated with his remaining forces into the fortified settlement of Alesia, believing the elevated terrain and thick defensive walls would force Julius Caesar into a prolonged and costly assault. Instead, Caesar transformed the entire landscape into a giant prison, designed not simply to defeat an enemy, but to suffocate an entire resistance movement into extinction. The Roman army arrived carrying more than swords and shields. They brought engineers. Within days, thousands of legionaries began constructing one of the most astonishing siege systems ever attempted in the ancient world. Caesar ordered a massive ring of fortifications built around Alesia, stretching nearly 10 miles across hills, valleys, forests, and open fields. Towers rose every few hundred feet. Deep trenches were dug and filled with water diverted from nearby rivers. Hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes were concealed beneath branches and dirt. Iron hooks and buried spikes turned the surrounding countryside into a killing field. But Caesar understood the true danger was not the defenders inside the city. It was the army gathering outside. Reports soon confirmed that massive Gallic reinforcements were marching toward Alesia from across the region. If the relief force attacked while Vercingetorix launched a breakout from inside the fortress, the Roman army could be trapped between two enormous enemy forces at once. Caesar responded with something almost unimaginable. He ordered a second ring of fortifications built facing outward. The Romans were now surrounded by their own walls. Inside Alesia, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Ancient sources describe severe starvation spreading through the settlement as food supplies vanished. Horses were slaughtered first, then pack animals. Eventually, civilians began dying in large numbers, while Roman fortifications tightened around the hilltop like a noose. According to several historical accounts, Vercingetorix eventually expelled women, children, and elderly civilians from the fortress, hoping the Romans would allow them to pass through the siege lines. Caesar refused. Thousands became stranded between the Roman fortifications and the walls of Alesia, with no food, no shelter, and nowhere to escape. Ancient writers describe desperate civilians collapsing in the open fields, while both sides watched helplessly from behind their defenses. Some reportedly survived for days among corpses before dying from starvation and exposure. Then the relief army arrived. Massive Gallic forces descended upon the Roman siege works from the outside, while defenders inside Alesia launched coordinated attacks against the inner walls. The battlefield erupted into chaos across miles of trenches, towers, and barricades. Flaming arrows streaked through the night. Roman soldiers fought simultaneously in opposite directions, while cavalry charges thundered across narrow openings between fortifications. At several points, the Roman lines nearly collapsed. One section of the outer defenses reportedly fell under overwhelming assault before Caesar personally entered the fighting with reserve forces. Witnesses describe legionaries battling knee-deep in mud and blood, while bodies filled the trenches designed to stop advancing troops. The siege system itself gradually became part of the slaughter, as attackers were impaled on hidden spikes or crushed beneath collapsing barricades during repeated assaults. When the fighting finally ended, the Gallic relief force shattered and retreated. Inside Alesia, starvation and exhaustion had destroyed any remaining hope. Vercingetorix surrendered shortly afterward, reportedly riding out before Caesar and laying his weapons at the Roman commander's feet in silence. But the fall of Alesia represented more than military defeat. It marked the destruction of organized Gallic independence itself. Entire tribes vanished into Roman control afterward, while surviving leaders were executed, enslaved, or absorbed into the expanding empire. Some historians believe Caesar understood from the beginning that Alesia was not merely a siege. It was a demonstration designed to prove that Rome could imprison an entire civilization, if necessary. Today, archaeologists still uncover traces of Caesar's fortifications buried beneath the French countryside. The circles of trenches and hidden traps remain visible from the air in certain seasons. They resemble scars cut directly into the landscape itself. The question left behind by Alesia is deeply unsettling. When an empire becomes powerful enough to surround an entire people and slowly erase their future from the outside inward, does resistance ever truly stand a chance? The Siege of Jerusalem. In 70 CE, beneath a sky illuminated by fire and collapsing stone, the city of Jerusalem descended into one of the most devastating sieges of the ancient world. What began as a rebellion against Roman occupation soon transformed into a catastrophe so violent that survivors later described the city as a graveyard burning from within. By the time the siege ended, tens of thousands were dead. The sacred heart of Jewish civilization had been reduced to ruins, and an empire had sent a message to the world about what happened to those who resisted Rome. The rebellion had already shaken the Roman Empire for years. Jewish resistance fighters had seized control of Jerusalem and driven Roman forces from the region in a humiliating uprising that spread across Judea. In response, Emperor Vespasian dispatched massive military forces under the command of his son, Titus, to crush the revolt permanently. By the spring of 70 CE, 4 Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem with siege camps stretching across the hills outside the city walls. But what made the siege truly horrifying was that Jerusalem had already begun destroying itself before the Romans ever breached the defenses. Inside the city, rival Jewish factions turned against one another in brutal internal conflict. Extremist groups battled for control of food supplies, executions became common, and warehouses containing vital grain reserves were deliberately burned during factional fighting. Ancient historians describe the streets filling with corpses, while starvation spread long before the Romans entered the city. Jerusalem became trapped between Roman steel outside and chaos within. Then Titus sealed the city completely. Roman engineers constructed a massive circumvallation wall around Jerusalem, nearly 5 miles long, in an astonishing display of military efficiency. Towers, checkpoints, and armed patrols ensured almost nobody could escape. Anyone caught attempting to flee faced crucifixion. Ancient accounts claim crosses eventually covered the surrounding hillsides in such numbers that wood became difficult to find. As food vanished, the siege descended into horror. Witnesses described people searching sewers, animal waste, and refuse piles for anything edible. Entire families reportedly died inside locked homes to avoid having food stolen by desperate mobs. Some accounts became so disturbing that later historians questioned whether they were exaggerated. Yet, archaeological evidence confirms extreme famine conditions throughout the city during the final months of the siege. Meanwhile, Roman siege engines battered the walls day and night. Massive battering rams hammered defensive towers, while catapults launched stones weighing hundreds of pounds into crowded districts below. Sections of the city shook continuously beneath bombardment. Fires spread through residential areas as defenders and attackers fought block by block across collapsing streets and stairways slick with blood. Then the temple burned. The Second Temple in Jerusalem was not merely a religious structure, it was the spiritual center of Jewish identity itself. Ancient writers describe towering white stone walls plated with gold so reflective they appeared like fire beneath sunlight. During the final assault, Roman soldiers breached the temple complex amid chaotic fighting. Exactly how the fire began remains disputed even today. Some sources claimed Roman troops acted against orders. Others believed the destruction was deliberate from the beginning. What is certain is that once the flames spread, panic consumed the city. Thousands of civilians crowded into the temple, seeking refuge as smoke and heat filled the courtyards. Roman soldiers slaughtered defenders among sacred chambers, while molten gold reportedly poured between shattered stones. By the end of the siege, much of Jerusalem had been destroyed or depopulated. The aftermath echoed far beyond the battlefield. The temple never recovered. Jewish communities scattered across the empire in what became a long and traumatic diaspora lasting centuries. Roman victory celebrations later displayed sacred objects taken from Jerusalem through the streets of Rome itself, immortalized on monuments that still exist today. Yet historians continue debating the deeper mystery surrounding the siege. Did Rome simply crush a rebellion, or intentionally erase the symbolic heart of an entire civilization to prevent future resistance forever? Fragments of burned stone uncovered in Jerusalem still bear signs of the destruction nearly 2,000 years later. Some blocks remain cracked from intense heat. Coins fused by fire have been recovered beneath collapsed streets. The city survived. The people survived. But something fundamental was broken during the siege of Jerusalem, and history has never fully escaped its shadow since. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest. In 9 CE, somewhere deep within the rain-soaked forests of Germania, 3 Roman legions vanished into darkness and never returned. For days, desperate screams echoed beneath towering pine trees, while mud swallowed armored soldiers attempting to flee through collapsing trails. Entire columns disappeared between the fog and the forest without ever seeing the enemy clearly. What happened in Teutoburg Forest became one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. A defeat so traumatic that Roman emperors reportedly woke from sleep years later, shouting for their lost legions to come home. The disaster began with trust. Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Roman Germania, believed the region was already under control. Roman forts had been constructed across the frontier, roads cut through forests, and local tribal leaders integrated into Roman administration. Among the most trusted allies was a Germanic nobleman named Arminius, a commander who had served with Roman forces and held Roman citizenship himself. To Varus, Arminius represented proof that Germania was slowly becoming civilized under Roman rule. In reality, the rebellion had already begun. Late in the summer, reports reached Varus describing unrest among distant tribes east of the Rhine River. Arminius advised the governor to move quickly through the forested interior to suppress the uprising before it spread further. Trusting his ally completely, Varus ordered nearly 20,000 soldiers, auxiliaries, servants, and camp followers into unfamiliar territory under worsening weather conditions. The march quickly deteriorated. Heavy rain transformed narrow forest roads into swamps of mud and broken branches. Roman supply wagons became trapped between trees while long columns stretched for miles through dense terrain, impossible to maneuver efficiently. Unlike traditional Roman battlefields, Teutoburg offered no open space for organized formations. Visibility collapsed beneath thick forest canopy and constant storms. Then the attacks began. At first, small groups of Germanic warriors struck isolated sections of the Roman line before disappearing into the woods. Javelins emerged from fog and trees without warning. Scouts vanished. Officers attempting to relay commands found roads blocked by fallen timber and panicked animals. Roman soldiers trained for disciplined warfare suddenly found themselves fighting shadows in terrain that seemed designed to consume them. What made Teutoburg terrifying was the complete loss of control. The Roman army could not see the battlefield. Units became separated in the rain and darkness while attacks erupted from every direction simultaneously. Ancient accounts describe Germanic fighters appearing briefly between trees before retreating into the forest again, forcing exhausted Roman troops into constant confusion and fear. Armor grew heavier with mud and water, while shields became nearly impossible to maneuver in the narrow terrain. Over the following days, the attacks intensified. Arminius had secretly united multiple tribes and carefully selected the ambush site long before the Romans entered the forest. Earthen barricades blocked escape routes, while hidden warriors waited along elevated ridges overlooking the Roman path. Every attempt to regroup collapsed beneath renewed assaults. Horses slipped in the mud, wagons overturned. Wounded soldiers drowned in flooded ditches, while others were cut down, trying to climb embankments under volleys of spears. Then the Roman line finally broke apart completely. By the final stage of the ambush, organized resistance had almost vanished. Small groups of legionaries fought isolated battles among trees and marshland, while Germanic warriors hunted survivors through the forest. Ancient sources claim Varus, realizing total defeat was unavoidable, took his own life rather than face capture. Almost nobody escaped. 3 entire Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were effectively annihilated. Their standards were captured, their camps erased. Many prisoners were reportedly sacrificed or executed after the battle. The exact location of much of the slaughter remained uncertain for centuries, though archaeological discoveries in modern Germany have uncovered human bones, broken weapons, and fragments of Roman armor buried beneath ancient soil. The psychological consequences inside Rome were catastrophic. Emperor Augustus allegedly wandered his palace in despair, repeating the words, "Varus, give me back my legions." The empire abandoned plans to fully conquer Germania afterward. The frontier hardened along the Rhine River and remained there for centuries. But the deeper mystery of Teutoburg Forest lies in how completely an empire built on order collapsed inside a wilderness it believed already controlled. Rome conquered vast civilizations across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Yet, inside a cold forest filled with mud, rain, and betrayal, its military machines simply disappeared. The Battle of Adrianople. In 378 CE, beneath the brutal summer heat of the Eastern Balkans, the Roman Empire marched toward a battle it believed would restore order along its frontier. Instead, the army walked directly into a catastrophe so severe that many historians consider it the beginning of Rome's irreversible collapse. By the end of the day, an emperor would vanish among piles of burning corpses. Entire elite legions would cease to exist, and the illusion of Roman military supremacy would be shattered forever. The crisis had started years earlier beyond the Danube River. Massive waves of Gothic refugees fled westward after the arrival of the Huns, nomadic horsemen whose sudden appearance triggered panic across entire regions of Eastern Europe. Tens of thousands of Goths petitioned Rome for asylum, promising loyalty in exchange for land and protection inside imperial territory. Roman authorities agreed, but corruption quickly turned desperation into rebellion. Officials stole food supplies, exploited starving refugees, and reportedly sold rotten meat to Gothic families at impossible prices. Some ancient sources even claimed children were traded into slavery in exchange for dog meat during the famine. The fragile alliance collapsed into open war. For months, Gothic forces moved across the Balkans, raiding settlements and defeating smaller Roman detachments. Emperor Valens, eager to secure a decisive victory before reinforcements from the Western Empire could arrive, marched toward the city of Adrianople with an army estimated at nearly 30,000 men. Advisors urged caution. Scouts reported large enemy cavalry formations nearby. Valens ignored the warnings. On the morning of August 9th, Roman forces advanced across dry plains beneath suffocating heat and smoke from burning fields. Exhausted soldiers arrived near the Gothic wagon camp after hours of marching without proper coordination. What they encountered did not resemble a traditional battlefield. The Goths had formed a massive defensive circle using wagons chained together into a fortified barricade filled with warriors, families, and supplies. Negotiations briefly began between both sides. Then the situation exploded into chaos. The exact trigger remains disputed. Some accounts blamed impatient Roman units launching unauthorized attacks. Others claimed Gothic cavalry suddenly appeared on the horizon before diplomacy concluded. Whatever happened, the battlefield transformed instantly into confusion and violence. Roman formations surged toward the wagon circle, while Gothic infantry resisted behind makeshift defenses of wood, shields, and spears. Then the Gothic cavalry struck. Thousands of mounted warriors crashed into the Roman flanks with devastating force. Dust storms rose across the plain as cavalry units encircled exhausted Roman infantry, already compressed together under extreme heat. Ancient historians describe soldiers collapsing from dehydration before enemy weapons even reached them. Commands became impossible to hear. Visibility vanished beneath smoke, dust, and screaming horses. What made Adrianople horrifying was the speed of the collapse. For centuries, Roman heavy infantry had dominated battlefields across the known world through discipline and formation tactics. At Adrianople, those formations disintegrated beneath relentless cavalry assaults and overwhelming pressure from multiple directions. Entire units were trapped so tightly together they could barely lift their shields. Others attempted to retreat only to discover escape routes blocked by fleeing soldiers and burning terrain. By late afternoon, the Roman army had ceased functioning as a coordinated force. The slaughter spread across the plains outside Adrianople, while Gothic cavalry hunted survivors attempting to escape. Thousands died where they stood. Others were crushed beneath the weight of retreating formations. Ancient accounts described heaps of bodies covering the battlefield, so densely that movement became nearly impossible in some areas. Then Emperor Valens disappeared. The exact details of his death remain uncertain even today. Some sources claimed he was struck by arrows while trying to retreat. Others reported he took refuge inside a nearby farmhouse that was later burned down by Gothic warriors, unaware the emperor was inside. No confirmed body was ever recovered from the battlefield. The aftermath sent shockwaves across the empire. Nearly two-thirds of the Eastern Roman field army had been destroyed. Entire veteran units vanished permanently. Frontier defenses collapsed across huge sections of the Balkans. For the first time in centuries, Rome could no longer guarantee dominance over the so-called barbarian nations gathering beyond its borders. But Adrianople represented more than military defeat. It exposed a terrifying truth that Roman leaders had tried to ignore for decades. The empire had become too large, too divided, and too exhausted to control the forces gathering around it. Historians often describe Adrianople as the moment Rome began dying from pressures it could no longer contain. The empire survived the battle, but after Adrianople, it would never fully recover its old certainty again. The Battle of the Frigidus. In 394 CE, inside a narrow mountain valley in what is now modern Slovenia, two Roman armies faced each other beneath dark storm clouds in a battle that would help decide not only the future of the empire, but the spiritual future of Europe itself. Tens of thousands of soldiers gathered along the banks of the Frigidus River, while priests, bishops, and pagan seers watched from opposite sides, each convinced the fate of civilization would be determined before the valley fell silent again. What followed became one of the deadliest and most symbolic civil wars in Roman history, a massacre where Romans slaughtered Romans while believing the gods themselves had entered the battlefield. The conflict began after the death of Emperor Valentinian II under deeply suspicious circumstances. His powerful general, Arbogast, quickly elevated a Roman official named Eugenius to the imperial throne in the Western Empire. Although Eugenius publicly presented himself as a legitimate ruler, many Christian leaders viewed the new regime as a dangerous revival of Rome's fading pagan traditions. In the East, Emperor Theodosius I declared war, framing the coming campaign not merely as a political struggle, but as a battle for the soul of the empire. By early September, both armies converged near the Frigidus Valley, a narrow corridor surrounded by steep mountains and exposed ridges. The terrain turned the battlefield into a natural killing zone. Retreat would be nearly impossible once the fighting began. Theodosius attacked first. His eastern army launched repeated assaults directly into heavily defended western positions, blocking the valley entrance. Ancient historians describe the opening attacks as catastrophic. Roman infantry advanced across rough terrain beneath volleys of arrows and javelins, while defensive formations held firm behind elevated positions. Thousands of Eastern soldiers were reportedly cut down within hours. Some accounts claim entire units vanished before even reaching enemy lines. What made the battle especially horrifying was the scale of sacrifice. Theodosius continued sending troops forward despite mounting casualties, believing divine intervention would eventually deliver victory. Many of the soldiers at the front were Gothic auxiliaries recently recruited into Roman service, and ancient sources suggest they suffered devastating losses during the repeated frontal assaults. Bodies accumulated across the valley floor, while wounded men drowned in shallow riverbanks, stained red with blood and mud. By nightfall, the Eastern army appeared close to collapse. Then the wind changed. Ancient chroniclers described a sudden violent storm descending through the valley on the second day of battle. Powerful winds reportedly blasted directly into the faces of Eugenius's western forces, driving dust, debris, and even arrows backward into their own lines. Standards toppled, visibility collapsed. Some soldiers interpreted the storm as supernatural intervention, favoring Theodosius, and panic spread rapidly across parts of the Western army. Whether the weather truly altered the battle or later historians exaggerated the event remains debated, but what followed was undeniable. The Eastern forces surged forward once again, while sections of the Western army began disintegrating under pressure. Defensive lines broke apart across the valley as cavalry and infantry clashes descended into chaotic slaughter. Soldiers who had once fought under the same Roman banners butchered one another among shattered shields and collapsing formations. Eugenius was captured and executed shortly afterward. Arbogast fled into the mountains and reportedly took his own life days later. The victory gave Theodosius complete control over the Roman Empire for the final time in history. But the consequences reach far beyond politics. After the Battle of the Frigidus, Christianity emerged as the undisputed dominant force within imperial power structures, while many surviving pagan institutions rapidly declined or disappeared altogether. Temples closed, ancient religious traditions faded. Philosophical systems that had shaped Rome for centuries began collapsing under the authority of a new ideological order. Some historians believe the Frigidus was more than a civil war. It was the symbolic funeral of the classical Roman world itself. The battlefield where Romans killed each other in the name of competing visions for civilization has never been fully identified with certainty. Archaeologists still debate the exact location of the bloodiest fighting, yet ancient accounts consistently describe mountains echoing with screams, storms tearing across collapsing formations, and entire sections of the valley buried beneath the dead. The Roman Empire survived the battle politically, but culturally and spiritually, something ancient ended forever beside the Frigidus River, the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. In 451 CE, across the vast open fields of northeastern Gaul, the remnants of the Roman world gathered for what many believed would be the final defense of Western civilization itself. Entire cities had already fallen before the advancing armies of Attila the Hun. Villages burned across the countryside, while survivors fled westward, carrying stories of mounted warriors appearing without warning, destroying settlements, and vanishing into smoke and ash before organized resistance could form. By the time Attila crossed into Gaul, fear alone had become one of his most powerful weapons. The Roman Empire was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. Decades of civil wars, invasions, economic collapse, and political corruption had weakened imperial authority across Europe. Entire frontier regions operated almost independently while barbarian kingdoms expanded inside former Roman territory. Yet, when Attila advanced deeper into Gaul with a coalition of Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and allied tribes, even Rome's enemies understood the danger. If the Huns succeeded, the balance of power across Europe could collapse completely. An unlikely alliance formed in response. The Roman general Flavius Aetius assembled a desperate coalition of Roman forces alongside Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, and several Germanic tribes that had once fought against the empire itself. Ancient historians describe the gathering army as less a unified force than a temporary survival pact between civilizations that normally distrusted one another. The battlefield chosen near the Catalaunian plains offered open terrain ideal for cavalry warfare, exactly the kind of environment where Attila's forces were most dangerous. As evening approached on the day of battle, both armies surged toward a strategic ridgeline, dominating the center of the plain. The fighting became immediate chaos. Witnesses described massive cavalry clashes unfolding beneath clouds of dust, so thick that entire formations disappeared from sight within minutes. Archers fired blindly into the haze while infantry struggled to maintain cohesion across uneven terrain crowded with thousands of men and horses. Unlike earlier Roman battles built around discipline and controlled formations, Catalaunian plains resembled a violent collision between collapsing worlds. What made the battle especially terrifying was the scale of destruction spreading across the field. Ancient writers claimed the dead covered the plains so densely that streams reportedly ran red for days afterward. One account described warriors slipping on blood-soaked grass while continuing to fight among bodies piled across the ridges. The Visigothic king, Theodoric, was killed during the battle, possibly trampled beneath cavalry during one of the largest charges of the engagement. His death nearly triggered panic among allied forces before his soldiers launched furious counterattacks against the Huns. At the center of the battlefield, Attila's forces constructed a defensive wagon circle as the fighting intensified around them. Roman and Visigoth troops repeatedly assaulted the position, while mounted Hunnic archers unleashed volleys from inside the barricades. Nightfall eventually halted the slaughter, but neither side had achieved complete destruction of the other. Then Attila retreated. The exact reason remains one of the great mysteries surrounding the battle. Some historians believe the Huns suffered unsustainable losses and feared encirclement. Others argue Aetius deliberately allowed Attila to escape, worried that eliminating the Huns completely might leave the Visigoths too powerful afterward. Ancient sources conflict heavily, and the battlefield itself has never revealed enough evidence to settle the question with certainty. What survived after the Catalaunian plains was not victory in the traditional sense. The Western Roman Empire remained critically weakened despite halting Attila's advance. Within only a few decades, the empire in the West would collapse entirely. Many historians therefore describe the battle as a final defensive convulsion of a civilization already dying from within. Rome had technically survived the invasion, but it no longer possessed the strength to restore the world it once controlled. Yet across centuries, the battle became immortalized as the moment Europe narrowly avoided destruction beneath the armies of Attila the Hun. The deeper question, however, remains deeply unsettling. Did the Catalaunian plains truly save Western civilization, or did it merely delay the inevitable collapse of the ancient world by a few final years? The battlefield fell silent long ago. The empire vanished. But the image of exhausted armies standing against the approach of total collapse continues to haunt history itself. Conclusion: these ancient battles reveal a disturbing pattern repeated across centuries of human history. Empires believed to be eternal collapsed in single afternoons. Armies considered invincible disappeared beneath forests, deserts, rivers, and burning cities. Entire civilizations placed their faith in military power, only to discover that strength alone could not protect them from ambition, betrayal, arrogance, or internal decay. But the deeper pattern hidden within these battles is even more unsettling. Again and again, history was rewritten by the survivors. Defeats became legends. Political disasters transformed into heroic myths. Propaganda replaced reality before the bodies on the battlefield had even decomposed. At Kadesh, a near catastrophe became a monument to victory. Thermopylae transformed a doomed defense into immortality. Cannae became a lesson studied for thousands of years, while the terror experienced by ordinary soldiers slowly disappeared behind tactical admiration. The cycle never truly ended. Many of these battles also exposed something empires rarely admit while they still exist. The greatest threats often came from within. Rome nearly destroyed itself through political rivalry at Arausio. Jerusalem collapsed while its own factions fought each other behind the walls. Adrianople exposed an empire weakened by corruption and arrogance long before the Goths shattered its army. By the time of the Catalaunian plains, Rome survived only by depending on outsiders to defend what remained of its power. And perhaps that is why these battles still haunt humanity today. They are not remembered simply because of bloodshed or military brilliance. They endure because they expose how fragile civilization truly is beneath the illusion of permanence. Every empire believes it stands at the center of history until the moment its armies break apart and its cities begin to burn. The ruins left behind by these battles still exist across Europe, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. Beneath forests, fields, and modern cities, fragments of armor, shattered weapons, and mass graves continue emerging from the ground centuries later. Silent reminders that entire worlds once collapsed, where people now walk without noticing. The question is no longer why these battles became legendary. The real question is why humanity continues repeating the same path toward destruction while believing the ending will somehow be different this time.